Hi developers, welcome back to Programming Fields. I'm Umesh Rana and I'm back here with episode 6 in the React 19 plus Laravel REST API Masterclass series. Today we reach a major turning point in your React journey, and trust me when I say this, from this episode onward, you are going to feel the power of actual React. And in this series, until now, we covered what React is, why React is the best choice in 2025, setup using Vite plus Burn, fundamentals of components, props, data flow, and communication between components, and also we saw how UI is broken down into small reusable pieces. We have worked with React component and props, which helped us build a structured reusable UI. And today we enter one of the most important concepts in the entire React ecosystem, because until now our components were static, that means no interactions, no changes, and no dynamic behavior between the components. But modern applications are interactive, that means they change when users interact. And the technology that gives React this ability is state. So today I'm going to explain state, not just a concept, but in such a way that you will never forget it for life. So before we begin, let me give you today's roadmap. We will first build absolute clarity on what a state really is. Then we will understand why a state is needed, because without understanding the why, the how has no value. We will then do a deep dive into the useState hook, which is the gateway to interactivity in React. Further, we will explore how re-renders work in React and why React behaves the way it does. And finally, we will see real-world examples like counters or toggles in order to understand and implement the concept of React state. And by the end of this video, you will be able to build dynamic, interactive components on your own. And this episode is designed so even a complete beginner will finally understand where a state fits in the bigger picture of React application. Okay, so let's start with what is a state. So let's understand this slowly and properly. In simple words, a state is the memory of your component. It is the data that changes over time based on user actions or system events. In the last video, we discussed about props. So props are external data which is passed into the component by its parent. But a state is internal data that the component itself controls. So you can imagine a component as a human brain, and inside that component we have the props which act like messages which other give you. But in other hand, the state is like what you remember, store, update, and react to. Now let's understand this using one example. So let's say when you make any shopping cart application, in shopping cart, which is showing number of items added in the cart, right? There we have one functionality like added products in the cart. So in that cart option, when we click on that particular cart, that shows all the added number of products in that cart. Another simple example, a search box which is updating text as you type in that input field, right? And in the same way, let's say you have a profile dropdown, and by clicking on that, this will open the profile details, right? So all of these depend on data that must change over time. And this type of data cannot be stored in props because props are read-only, okay? But a state allows your component to think and update itself. And here is the magic. Whenever a state changes, React automatically re-renders the component. And this updates the UI in the browser instantly in the browser DOM. So that is why React is called React, because it reacts to a state changes automatically and then it reflects automatically in the browser. And without a state, your app is just a static HTML website where there won't be any interaction on that. But with state, your app becomes dynamic, alive, and interactive. Now, why do we need a state? In order to understand this better, let's think about how you use applications daily. So let's say you scroll on Instagram to check the feed updates, right? You click like and then the count increases. Also, let's say in Amazon website, when you add an item to Amazon cart, the cart icon updates automatically. Also, when you click play on YouTube video, the timestamp starts increasing based on the video length. So none of this is possible without a state. So simply you can say props only allow you to pass data down, because we already discussed props will help passing the data from parent to child, and they cannot create interaction. Now let me give you a real world example. So props are just like a safe that gives you a dish, and a state is like you add salt or a spice as you like according to your taste. So a state is what gives the user the power to interact with the UI. So a state is required when data changes. This will update the UI, and when the user interacts, the data is stored inside component. So that is why every interactive component you will ever build in React, just like from a button to a full dashboard, is powered by React state. Now we will understand the differences between props and state. So this is one of the most important foundational concept in React, to understand the difference between props and state, because in many of the interview they can ask like what is the difference between props and state. So let's start with the props. Props are just like arguments passed to a function that we already discussed in the last video. They come from outside the component, usually from a parent component, and the receiving component cannot change them. That's why the props are immutable. That means when you pass any parameter, just like any props from parent component to child, the child component cannot make any changes in that particular value. The child component only can use them. So let's understand this using example. So let's say if a parent component sends a title or a user object to the child component, the child component will receive that and will display it or use it only. It cannot modify the data in the child component. Now let's compare this with state. So a state is internal. This is the component's data, and the component owns it, and it can change it whenever it needs to. So these changes are what make the UI interactive. That means when the state will change, it will re-render the UI in the browser. That's why this is called interactive or reactive, because on every change of state, this will re-render the UI. For example, when you type in an input field, pressing a button, or even toggling dark mode to light, all of these actions need the component to remember something, and that memory is state. And here is the key difference in one line. So props tell the component what to display, and state tells the component how to behave. If props are just like ingredients coming from outside, then state is just like the internal recipe your component follows. And we have another important point, like when state changes, React automatically re-renders the component to show the updated UI in the browser. And when props change, React re-renders too, but only when the parent updates them. Because in the child component, props cannot be modified by the child component. So when should a component receive data, which is called props, and when should a component control data, which is like state. So once this difference is clear, React hooks, especially useState, will start making complete sense. Now we will talk about how state make UI interactive. So whenever someone clicks a button or types something, React listens to that event. Then based on those events, you call the state updater function. And based on that, React updates the state. Then further this re-renders the component and the UI changes in the browser. So this cycle is what makes React reactive. Now before we talk about the useState hook, we need to understand what a hook actually is in React. So hooks are a feature which are introduced in React version 16.8 that completely changed how React applications are written. Earlier in older versions of React, that means before 16.8 React version, in order to manage state or lifecycle events, like when a component mounts or updates, developers had to use class components. The class components were powerful, but they came with many challenges. They were harder to understand, involve a lot of boilerplate, and needed the confusing this keyword everywhere. So React introduced hooks to solve these problems in React 16.8 version. So you can say a hook is simply a special function or inbuilt function provided by React that lets your functional component use important features just like state management, side effects, refreshing DOM elements, managing performance, context or state sharing. And the most important thing to remember is hooks allow functional components to have power that only class components used to have. Also, all hooks name start with the keyword use. So that's why we have hooks like useState, useEffect, useRef, useMemo, useCallback, useContext, etc. And also we can create custom hooks in React. So we will dive deep into the hooks in upcoming videos, where we will go through each and every hooks provided by React. So now think of hooks like this. Hooks allow components to think, remember, react and behave, not just display UI. And this foundation is important because useState is the first and most important hook that we are going to see in React. But don't worry regarding the hooks. We have separate videos in the playlist on every hooks, so we will cover these hooks in the upcoming episodes. Now that we know what a state is and why it is needed, now let's talk about the tool that React gives us to manage it, the useState hook. So useState is imported from React, and this allows a functional component to store a piece of data and update it within the component. So when you use this useState hook, you define an initial value and React stores it internally. So if we'll check out this syntax, here we have useState function in which we will have the initial value, and this useState function will return one array in which we will have two parameters. The first parameter will be like value, which will return the previous value, and the second parameter, which is set value, it will be like a function that will be used to set the value. So this will return the current value and a function to update that value, because you cannot update that value directly without this function. And every time when you call the update function, React will re-render the component based on the changes. Okay. So this is how the UI always stays in sync with the current value of the state. And useState hook is the foundation on which interactive React components are built. Now let's understand this using practical example. So we already have the React 19 project set up. I will quickly jump to the code editor. And so far we created these all components. In the components we have the folder like feature, layout and UI. So at very first I will create one more component inside this feature. So I will just right click on this and will create a new file, and I will give a component name as counter.jsx. So I'm going to implement a basic counter application first in order to give the basic idea of how a state will work here inside this React component. So firstly, I will create one function which will be component. So I will define as const counter and I will use fat arrow function. If you want, you can use basic function. Now inside this, I will return one HTML which is JSX again, and I will return h1 and I will return some value of counter. So currently I will set as 0. Okay, and from here we have to export this component. So I will write export const counter, and just below this I will create one button and I will give a label as increment. Now we have two elements here, so we'll have to wrap in a single parent element. So better I will use empty fragment that we already discussed in the last video, right? Now we have exported this component from here, but in order to render this component, we have to call it somewhere. So I will navigate to the app.jsx component because this is our primary component, right? And from here, I will just comment these all components rendering, and I will just render that newly created counter component. So I will call counter and this will be imported automatically here from counter. Okay. And these all are highlighting because we have not used the variables and functions anywhere because we have commented these all things. Okay, so let's save it and let's navigate to the browser. And here I will access this application. So we have counter label and we have the initial value as 0. Now what I want, when I will click on this button, this counter value should be incremented automatically. So let's implement this. Firstly, we'll define one on-click event on this. So on this counter component, we have one button, right? So I will define on-click and I want to increment the counter value. So I will call one function as increment. Okay, you can give any name. And here, just before this return, I will define this function as increment and I will use fat arrow function again. Now what I want, this counter value should be dynamic. So for that, firstly I'll just define a normal variable just like const count and I will set this to 0. Now I will render this variable here. So I will use curly bracket just like this. Now what I want, from this increment function, I want to increase the count value by 1. So what I will do, firstly we have defined this as const, so we cannot reassign the incremented value in the same variable, right? So what I will do, I will change this to let or var. Okay, and here I will just increment this count plus equals 1. This is the simple concept we do in JavaScript or any function just in order to increment or decrement the value, right? We have defined one variable with the initial value and on function we have incremented the value by 1 and this function is being triggered on this button click. Now will this update this increment value here? Let's see this in the browser. So I will jump to the browser. I will click on increment and you can see I'm clicking but nothing is happening here. Why? It should increment the value by 1 but still this is not incrementing. Now what I will do, I will put one console here after incrementing this value. So I will use console log and I will use count. So in this function, we are just incrementing the value of this count variable by 1 when we'll click on this button. And after incrementing the value, this should print the count value here in this console log. Now let's check out the result. So I will just open the developer console and I will navigate to the console tab. Now I will just refresh it once. Okay, we don't have anything here. Now I will click on this increment. Yes, when I clicked on this increment button, this incremented this counter value from 0 to 1. Now if I will increment one more time, yes, this time this has incremented the previous value which was 1 to 2. Same thing, this has incremented to 3, 4. So this counter value is incrementing on that button click, right? Which is correct. But that incremented value is not reflected here in the browser. However, we have used the same variable here in order to print this counter value in the browser, right? We have the same variable as count, but this incremented counter value is not reflecting immediately in this UI. That is the problem here in the React, right? Because React does not track normal JavaScript variables. Here we have defined the normal JavaScript variable and we are rendering that variable after incrementing that. So React is not able to understand with that normal JavaScript variable. This will only updates the UI when its internal state changes, because React only listens the internal state changes. It won't track the normal JavaScript variables changes. And that can only happen through React's own system, not by changing a plain JavaScript variable. So in a normal JavaScript function, changing a variable simply changes the value in the memory. But in React, your component is a function that re-renders. And the re-render will happen only when React detects changes, like when the state has changed, or props has been changed, or even parent component has re-rendered. Then based on the parent re-rendering, it will also re-render the child component. But here we are changing count manually without React. So React has no idea that this value has changed by clicking on this increment button. So the UI remains stuck at 0, which is our initial value forever. Even though console log shows the incremented working, but the component does not re-render. And that is the entire reason behind inventing the React state. So I hope you understood this problem, why we need state in React. Now let's solve it using React state. So firstly, I will jump to the code editor. And here I will import useState hook from React. So for that, just above this component, I will write import, because this React 19 will work on the latest ECMAScript syntax. So we will have to use import instead of require function. Okay. So we will use import useState. Okay. And this will be imported from React. So when we'll hit enter, this will be imported from React, and we have to wrap it in curly braces, because from this React we are importing multiple functions. Now after importing this useState, firstly I will just put one console.log useState, and this is a function, so we have to open it just like parenthesis, and here we have to pass one initial parameter. Okay, it could be of any data type like number, string, array, or object. So as of now, I will pass number as integer, and I will jump to the browser. Now I will refresh it once. So in this console log, this has returned one array having 2 index, right? Which is 2 elements. So in the first position 0 index, we have one value as 0. But in the second position, that means on index 1, we have one function, right? So this is basically one function, and these two are returning from this useState function. Now let's say here instead of this 0, I will set some value like 12. And when I'll refresh it, here the initial value has returned as 12, which is previous value, right? We can consider it as previous value or old value or initial value. So in the first index, this always will have the initial value or the previous value. And in the second argument, this will have one function in order to change this value. So from here, we will have to extract these two parameters, which is initial value and the function. So for this, we will be using destructuring. Here we have this array. So we will be using array destructuring. So what I will do, I will remove this console. And at the left side, here I will extract those two key, which is initial value and the function. So we can give any name because it is not like we have to set any key or any variable here, because these two are array element, right? This is the first 0th index and this is first index. So we will be just extracting these two elements from this array. So I will extract and set it in a variable. So what I will do, I will define one empty array just like this, because this is array here, right? And for extracting the first index value, because this is a normal number value, which is coming from this initial state, which we have defined inside this useState function. And here I will just capture this in a variable, let's say count. Now here we can remove this count because this will return the count from this useState function itself, and inside this we have already passed this initial value. Now I will assign this in a variable like const. And here we had one more element inside this array, which was function, right? So for the function, we have to extract the function. So we can set any name here. So the naming convention must be like, if the first index, which is returning the value, is like value, then the second index will have the function, right? So it should be like set value, so that this will identify this is a function which will update the initial value which is returning from this state. So let's say for this count, it should be like set count. This is the ideal approach. Now this is throwing warning because of this count. Let's comment it. This also, okay. And here, this set count is not used now. So we'll have to use this set count here in order to increment the value. So this set count is basically one function which will take the previous value. So our previous value is coming in the count variable, right? And I want to increase this by 1. So I can write count plus 1. Now let's jump to the browser. And here we have this initial value of count as 12, because here we set this count to 12, right? So what I will do, initially I will set this to 0. And here I will just try to click on this increment button. Yes, when I clicked on this increment, this has reflected the counter value in the browser as 1, but in the console, this has still showing 0. Now let's increment it one more time. Yes, in the browser, this time we have the value as 2, but in the console, we have the value as 1. So this means in the console, we are not able to see the value in the real time. Instead, it is showing the previous value here. But in the UI, it is reflecting immediately when the counter value is being incremented. So we will come to this part later. Firstly, let's understand how this counter is working here. So inside this function, this set count function is basically one state updater function. Here, it could be any function name. But again, I'm repeating, this is like naming convention of this React. If you are using count here, ideally it should be like set count, so that this will give a meaningful name like this is setting the value of count. Now let's say if you have changed this to value, then this should be like set value. But even if we keep it as set count, this won't impact anything. Here respectively we will have to change this variable. If we'll check out to the browser, if we'll increment it, yes, still we have incremented values. But this is not as per the variable, right? So ideally it should be the meaningful variable and function. So whenever we click on this increment button, this is firing this increment function, and inside this we are just updating the initial value of this counter and we are incrementing this by 1, right? So when this updates the state value using this setCount function, this will re-render the component in the browser. And accordingly, this will update the UI to reflect the new updated value which is being changed using this setCount function. So this is the working flow behind the scene of using useState hook. Now let's talk about why this console value is not reflecting immediately, why this is showing 1 behind this original value. So in the UI we have the updated value as 8, but in the console this is showing till 7, right? So when we click on this button the first time, the UI shows as 1. So let me just clear this. So let's say we have the initial value as 0 of this counter, right? When I'll click on this increment, yes, the initial value was 0, but in the UI, this has reflected as 1 by incremented it to 1. So in the UI, this shows 1, and in the console, this shows 0. Same thing if I'll click one more time. Yes, in the UI, we have 2, and in the console, we have 1. So this is happening because React schedules the updates. That means it does not update value immediately. Instead, it just schedules it. So you can think of setCount function, which is this function. So you can think of it as, hey React, please update the state whenever you are ready. So when this function execution will be completed, then only this will update that value and it will reflect it here in the browser. So in the same function, this count value is being incremented, right, and reflecting in the browser. But in the console, this is showing the old value, that means the previous value, because React has not applied that update yet. And this is why the console logs shows the previous number instead of the updating number. So you'll have to remember this point. A state does not update immediately. Instead, React batches updates and re-renders after your function completes. So inside the same function, you will always see the older value. Now let's say if I will console this log outside this, okay, if I will come to the browser, if I will refresh, so first time we have the counter value as 0, which is initial value, right? Now if we'll click on increment, yes, now we can see we have value as 1. If I will click on increment one more time, yes, now we have value as 2. So that means when the increment function has been executed successfully, this has applied that changes in this count value, which is value, right? And here it reflected immediately. So now the UI and console both are synced together. So I hope you understood this concept, like how state is working here in the React. So that's it for this video. You just completed one of the most important episodes of this entire masterclass. So let's recap what we have covered in this episode. We have covered state. So the state is the engine of React, and mastering it makes you capable of building every kind of interactive UI. Now in the upcoming episodes, we will dive more deep into React, and also we will check out life cycles and other hooks, which is where React begins to interact with the real world applications. So if you find this video helpful, make sure you subscribe and follow the playlist, because this masterclass will turn you into a full stack React plus Laravel developer step by step. So once again, thanks for watching and I will see you in the next video.